I noticed it first on a Friday evening. My wife, Amy, was unusually distant. After 8 years of marriage, I'd gotten used to the rhythm of her emotions and moods, the subtle changes in her expressions and tone, so the difference wasn't hard to miss. But this time, something deeper lingered beneath her aloofness, a coolness that seemed out of place in our otherwise warm, familiar routines. We'd been to a dinner party a few days prior, thrown by a friend of hers from work. It was a pleasant evening, or so I thought, but something about her behavior that night gnawed at me. I could feel it even now. She was more animated than usual, laughing with an extra edge, like she was performing, almost. And then there was Dave. He was one of her colleagues, someone she'd mentioned casually once or twice. Tall, clean-cut, a little too confident, the kind of guy who left an impression. At the party, I noticed him watching her. Not in an overtly obvious way, but in those glances that lingered a beat too long. Whenever she laughed or told a story, his eye stayed on her, and every time he spoke, she seemed a little too interested, leaning in a little too close. I told myself it was nothing, just harmless fun, but an uncomfortable feeling lodged in the pit of my stomach, something I couldn't shake. Later, when I mentioned it, she laughed it off, calling him just a funny guy from work. That answer didn't sit right with me. There was something she wasn't saying. I knew Amy better than that, also I thought. Then came the excuses. The following week, she mentioned she'd be working late, that there was a last-minute project she needed to handle. She didn't usually work nights, and she'd never talked about any big deadlines. But I held my tongue, reminding myself that sometimes things just happened. I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. But as the week went on, her behavior grew stranger. She kept her phone close, often texting or scrolling with a faint smile that disappeared as soon as I entered the room. She'd be back late from work, her explanations rushed, vague. Still, I bit my tongue, determined to give her the benefit of the doubt. Until one morning, when she left her phone on the table in her rush to get ready for work. As she showered, I found myself staring at it. My mind wrestled with my instinct to look, to confirm or disprove my suspicions, but I didn't want to be that guy, the jealous, insecure husband who snoops through his wife's phone. But as I was about to turn away, the phone buzzed. My heart pounded as I glanced down and saw a message from a number I didn't recognize. It wasn't a name, just a Virginia area code, and I realized I'd seen that same area code on her phone call log recently, though I hadn't paid it much mind before. I felt a cold dread creep over me, but I looked away, my hand hovering over the phone, torn between a strange sense of guilt and an overwhelming need to know. The decision gnawed at me all morning. I convinced myself that the unknown number didn't mean anything, that I should simply ask her. But as the day dragged on, I became increasingly unsettled. Memories of the dinner party flickered in my mind, Amy laughing, leaning a bit too close to Dave, his intent gaze on her, their little exchanges that felt a tad too familiar. And the questions lingered, what if there was something more? That evening, she came home later than usual, her face flushed. When I asked how work went, she barely looked me in the eye, just muttered something about deadlines and moved past me. I wanted to press her for more, to ask what was really going on, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the dread of hearing something I wasn't ready for. The doubts only grew stronger. The next morning, as she left for work, I couldn't help myself. I checked her phone records. Scrolling through, I saw the Virginia number pop up repeatedly, especially during late hours. The same number, day after day, sometimes multiple times in a single evening. A knot twisted in my stomach, my heart thudding as I tried to make sense of it. I kept quiet, telling myself I'd confront her once I had more clarity. Maybe there was an explanation, maybe it was all just some elaborate misunderstanding. But as the days wore on, her distance grew. She was detached, always on edge, her phone glued to her hand. She hardly even looked at me anymore. After a few days of silent observation, I decided I couldn't just sit back any longer. I needed to know. With a sinking heart, I hired a private investigator. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, it felt like a betrayal of everything we'd built together. but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was happening behind my back. I reasoned that if I was wrong, I'd make amends, confess my fears, and rebuild our trust. But if I was right, well, I wasn't sure how I'd handle that. The days that followed were torture. Each time she'd leave, I'd glance at my phone, half expecting the investigator to call with an update, half dreading what he'd say. I tried to keep things normal, to act like everything was fine, but the tension was unbearable. I found myself withdrawing, my own frustration and anger simmering beneath the surface, knowing that the truth, whatever it was, would soon come to light. It was on a Thursday afternoon, a few days after hiring the investigator, that I got the call. I was sitting in my office, pretending to work, though my mind had been anywhere but on my tasks. My phone buzzed, and the investigator's voice crackled through the line, calm but firm. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. He'd followed her the night before. She hadn't been working late, she'd met up with Dave, sneaking off to a quiet, secluded restaurant. They'd shared a meal, their heads close together, laughing, exchanging intimate smiles. Later, they'd driven off together to a hotel. The confirmation sent a shockwave through me, a white-hot rage that clouded my vision, and a deep, hollow ache that settled in my chest. Every moment we'd shared, every memory, every late-night conversation, every plan for the future, it all felt meaningless, a flimsy facade hiding her betrayal. But I knew what I had to do. The confirmation of Amy's betrayal hung over me like a storm cloud. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was her and Dave together. The next morning, I went through the motions, though everything felt hollow. I made coffee, left a note about having a long day, and tried to hold it together. Inside, I was a live wire of rage and pain, but I kept telling myself I had to keep calm, had to stay strategic. When Amy came home that night, she was her usual self, or at least she tried to be. She gave me a kiss on the cheek as she walked through the door, but it felt forced. She avoided eye contact, murmuring something about being tired from work. I wondered how many times she'd come home like this before, keeping secrets behind a weary smile. I kept my composure, though my heart pounded as she moved around the house, preparing for dinner. I knew I couldn't let on what I'd learned, not yet. I needed to wait for the right moment, when I'd gathered every scrap of evidence and she'd have nowhere to hide, no room for her usual excuses or attempts to brush things off. I felt like I was watching our marriage unravel in slow motion, each interaction a reminder of how much had been a lie. The following weekend, she told me she had to leave for a work conference in a neighboring city. I felt a surge of anger as she explained the last-minute plans, but I kept my voice even, nodding and wishing her a safe trip. She packed a small bag, kissed me goodbye, and disappeared for what she thought was just another work trip. But I wasn't about to let her have another weekend with Dave without consequences. As soon as she was gone, I packed my own bag, jumped in the car, and drove to the city where her conference was supposed to be. It was an exhausting 2-hour drive, my mind racing the whole way, every mile adding to the tension. I knew the investigator had followed her, but I needed to see it for myself. I needed to be there to witness the truth that she couldn't deny. When I arrived, I called the investigator, who confirmed the location, a small, nondescript hotel on the outskirts of town. I parked a few blocks away and waited, my stomach churning as I watched the building. After about an hour, she appeared. She was laughing, and I could see the familiar figure of Dave by her side. They held hands as they walked toward the entrance, as if they were any ordinary couple, without a care in the world. Seeing them together was a knife to the chest. The way she looked at him, the ease with which she leaned into his shoulder, it was as if she'd forgotten everything we'd shared. The years we'd spent together, the dreams we'd built, the promises we'd made. They meant nothing to her, not in that moment. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I didn't confront her, didn't cause a scene. I simply took out my phone, snapped a few pictures from my position, and recorded a short video. My hands shook as I hit record, but I forced myself to stay steady, to capture every detail that would serve as evidence later. I couldn't let emotions control me, not yet. There would be time for that later, when she had no escape, no lies left to hide behind. After they disappeared into the hotel, I waited a few minutes, then returned to my car. My heart felt like a lead weight, and a part of me just wanted to drive off, leave everything behind. But I knew I couldn't. There was more to do, more evidence to collect to ensure she'd have no choice but to face what she'd done. My marriage was already over, but I'd be damned if I let her walk away unscathed, pretending like none of it mattered. Over the next few days, I kept my distance, quietly documenting every suspicious behavior, every lie, every late-night text. Each piece of evidence fueled my determination, strengthening my resolve. By the time she returned from her conference, I had everything I needed to confront her. The moment finally came one quiet evening. She walked into the house after another long day at work, and I was ready. I sat at the kitchen table, the evidence spread before me, the photos, the call logs, the text messages. My heart hammered in my chest as she set her things down, oblivious to what awaited her. "Hey," I said, my voice calm, but she must have sensed something in my tone because she paused, looking at me with a hint of worry. "Is everything okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Oh, I think we need to talk," I replied, gesturing to the evidence on the table. "There are a few things we need to clear up." Her face drained of color as she looked at the photos, the logs, the texts. She stammered, trying to explain, to deny, but I cut her off, my voice cold and steady. "Don't lie to me, Amy," I said, my patience finally worn thin. "I know everything. I've known for weeks." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her excuses, her rehearsed lines, they all fell apart in the face of undeniable proof. Her mask crumbled, and for the first time, I saw the raw fear in her eyes. She knew there was no going back, no way to undo the betrayal that lay between us. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, a vindication of sorts. I'd been gaslit, lied to, and manipulated for months, but now I held the truth in my hands, and she couldn't deny it any longer. I could see the reality sinking in, the weight of her actions pressing down on her as she realized that everything was out in the open. As she stood there, silent and defeated, I knew that this was only the beginning. There was still so much more to say, so much anger and hurt to work through. But I also knew that I'd already made my decision. After that night, everything changed. The house was no longer a home, it was a silent battleground, thick with tension and unsaid words. Amy moved around like a ghost, as if afraid to make too much noise, her steps tentative, her voice barely above a whisper. She must have sensed that nothing she could say would change what I felt. And she was right. The confrontation had left us both drained, yet in some twisted way, I felt a dark satisfaction. After all, she was finally seeing the consequences of her actions, and there was no escaping it now. But I wasn't interested in rehashing her excuses, her attempts at justifying her betrayal. Every time she tried, I'd walk out of the room, shutting the door on her explanations and pleas, a wall between us that she couldn't penetrate. One morning, about a week after our confrontation, I noticed her sitting at the kitchen table, a letter in her hand. She was waiting for me, her expression unreadable. She must have been up for hours, her hair disheveled, dark circles shadowing her eyes. I could tell she hadn't slept. She looked up when I entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. I knew she was hoping I'd say something, maybe even something to mend the divide, but I only waited in silence. Finally, she slid the letter across the table toward me. I glanced down, recognizing the insignia on the envelope. It was from her office, a formal reprimand or worse, from the looks of it. She had been under review since I'd confronted her, and apparently, word of her relationship with Dave had reached her boss. Her job, the very thing she'd claimed to be doing when she was sneaking around with him, was now in jeopardy. "I'm losing my job, Will," she whispered, her voice raw, almost pleading. I picked up the letter, scanning it quickly. It confirmed what I'd suspected, they were letting her go. Her relationship with Dave, another married colleague, had violated company policy, and with so many witnesses and evidence to back it up, there was no way she could keep her position. I set the letter back on the table, barely glancing at her. "What did you expect?" A flash of something crossed her face, anger, regret, maybe both, but she held her tongue. She just looked down, fidgeting with the edge of the letter, as if she could fold it into a different shape and make it disappear. She tried to speak again, her voice trembling. I know I made a mistake, Will. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, we can. I cut her off, my tone cold. You think a few sessions with a therapist will erase what you did? Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, trying to touch my hand, but I pulled away. I felt a flare of bitterness rise up inside me, a surge of anger that I'd been suppressing since the day I'd found out. You destroyed everything, Amy. Our marriage, our life, everything we built together. You threw it all away for what? For him? She shook her head, her voice a strangled whisper. It wasn't about him. I don't know, I was lost. I felt like something was missing, like I wasn't enough, and he made me feel wanted. I scoffed, unable to hide my disdain. Wanted? That's what you think? So you betrayed me because you wanted someone else to look at you like you mattered? Her face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Part of me wanted to feel sympathy, maybe even forgiveness, but another part, the stronger, angrier part, wouldn't allow it. I stood up, pushing my chair back with a scrape against the tile, and walked out of the room without a word. I knew she wanted absolution, a way to ease the guilt that must have been tearing at her, but I wouldn't give her that. Not now. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and our house became a shell. She'd sleep in the guest room, leaving early each morning and returning late, as if trying to avoid the reality of our shattered marriage. I went through the motions, focusing on work, running errands, doing anything to keep from confronting the emptiness that hung over us. Friends and family started calling, noticing the strain, asking if everything was all right, but I kept my responses vague, not wanting to explain the shame of our broken vows. Then, one evening, as I was about to head out for a walk to clear my mind, I saw a car pull up outside. It was him. Dave. He stood there awkwardly, looking up at the house with a conflicted expression. I watched from the window, my fists clenched, feeling a fresh wave of anger rise in my chest. The audacity, the absolute gall of him to show up here after everything. I opened the door before he could even make it up the steps, standing firmly in the doorway to block his way. What are you doing here? I demanded, my voice low and seething. Dave looked taken aback, as if he hadn't expected me to confront him. He stammered, glancing around as if hoping Amy would appear to save him. I just wanted to talk to Amy. I thought, maybe I could explain things to her. Explain? I let out a bitter laugh. You think showing up here and talking to her will make things better? You think she's still waiting for you? He looked down, shifting uncomfortably, but I wasn't done. You don't belong here, Dave. You destroyed my life, my marriage, and now you think you can waltz back in and make it right with a few words? He swallowed, looking genuinely uncomfortable, maybe even regretful, but it didn't soften me. I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Didn't mean for this to happen? I repeated, incredulous. You didn't think, did you? You didn't think about me, or about her, or about what your actions would do. You were too busy chasing some fantasy, too selfish to consider anyone but yourself. He opened his mouth to respond, but I was done listening. I took a step forward, my stance firm, making it clear he wasn't welcome. Get off my property. Don't come back here. Ever. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he must have seen the rage in my eyes because he nodded, backing away slowly before turning and walking back to his car. I watched as he drove off, feeling a strange sense of triumph, but it was hollow, tainted by the wreckage he'd left in his wake. When I walked back inside, Amy was standing in the hallway, her face pale as she looked at me. She must have seen him from the window, watched the whole exchange. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand. I don't want to hear it, Amy. Not now, not ever. She closed her mouth, her eyes downcast, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her expression. Not fear of me, but fear of the emptiness that had settled between us, the irreversible damage she'd inflicted. There was nothing left to say. Nothing could change what had happened. The silence between us was final, a wall neither of us could climb. That night, I made a decision. The decision sat heavily on me as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The silence of the house pressed in around me, a void where laughter and love used to be. I had made up my mind, there was no more debating or second-guessing. By morning, I'd know exactly how to end this chapter of my life. But as I was packing my things, a memory surfaced. It was from years ago, early in our marriage, when Amy and I were still crazy about each other, still wrapped up in our plans and promises. I remembered a time she'd looked at me, with a mix of awe and love, and whispered, "Whatever happens, let's promise we'll never leave without really knowing each other." It had seemed like a beautiful sentiment back then, so romantic, so idealistic. Now, it felt like an empty vow, words that couldn't carry the weight of betrayal and loss. And yet, the memory lingered, unsettling me. If I was going to end this, I needed closure. I needed her to see and feel the pain she'd caused. I needed to know if there was any truth left between us. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen, stirring a cup of coffee with a vacant stare. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale. She barely looked up when I entered, but I took a seat across from her, steadying myself for what was to come. "Amy," I began, my voice rough, "I need to understand why. I need you to tell me the truth, not the rehearsed excuses or the guilt-ridden apologies. I want to know why you did it." She looked up, startled, her eyes meeting mine for the first time in weeks. For a moment, she said nothing, just took a deep breath, her hands trembling around the coffee cup. "It wasn't about him, Will," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I don't even think I cared about him. He was just there. A distraction." "A distraction from what?" I demanded, my patience wearing thin. "From myself," she said softly, almost to herself. I was losing who I was. We had this perfect life, you were always so driven, so successful, and I felt like I was just fading into the background. And instead of telling you, instead of trying to work through it, I took the coward's way out. I thought if someone else wanted me, maybe I'd feel real again. Her words stung, hitting harder than I'd expected. She had broken us for such a shallow, selfish reason. But at least it was the truth. I stood up, the finality of my decision washing over me. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice flat. She looked up, a fresh wave of tears in her eyes, but she didn't beg this time. Maybe she finally understood that there was no going back. As I walked toward the door, I heard her call out one last, shaky "I'm sorry," but I didn't turn back. Over the next few days, I moved out and started the paperwork for the divorce. Friends and family reached out, but I kept it brief, not interested in reliving the pain through retelling. I threw myself into work, trying to piece together some semblance of normalcy. Then, one evening, about a month after I'd left, I received a package in the mail. No return address, no markings, just a simple, unassuming box. Inside was an old photo album, one that I didn't even remember us making. As I flipped through the pages, memories flooded back, images of our life together that seemed almost unreal now. Our wedding day, vacations, holidays, random snapshots of quiet mornings and laughter-filled nights. But tucked in the back was a single letter. It was from Amy. "Will, I know you won't believe me, and I know this doesn't change anything, but I have to say it. Leaving you has torn me apart in ways I can't even describe. I wish I could go back and change things, but we both know that's impossible. I want you to know that I'm working on myself, trying to understand how I became someone who could betray everything we built together. I found this album while I was clearing out the house, and I wanted you to have it. Whatever we became, whatever you think of me now, I want you to remember that once we were something beautiful. Thank you for every moment, every memory. I don't deserve it, but I'll treasure it always. Amy." I closed the album, a lump in my throat. Her words didn't change anything, they couldn't. But they stirred something in me, an ache that was more complex than anger, more tangled than the need for revenge. For the first time, I wondered if she was really trying to heal, if maybe she was piecing together the broken parts of herself that had led her to this place. Months passed, and I found myself in a tentative peace, my days no longer haunted by betrayal. I didn't expect to hear from her again. But then, as I was sitting on my porch one warm spring evening, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Amy. "Will, please, if you can, meet me one last time." I stared at the screen, unsure. Part of me wanted to delete the message, to leave the past buried. But something, a quiet, persistent curiosity, compelled me to reply. The following week, I found myself sitting across from her at a small cafe, feeling as if I were meeting a stranger. She looked different, almost unrecognizable, as if the months had aged her years. Her face was somber, her expression guarded. After a few moments of awkward silence, she took a deep breath and looked me in the eye. "I needed to see you," she began, her voice steady but soft. "I've spent these last few months trying to understand myself, trying to face what I did and why. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to ask for something else." I watched her, my curiosity piqued. "What is it?" She hesitated, looking down as she spoke. "I wanted to thank you. For the years we had, for everything. But also for leaving. It forced me to look at who I'd become. I needed that. I'm a better person now, and I owe that to you." I nodded, absorbing her words. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to hash out. As we parted ways that day, I felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted. We weren't friends, and we'd never be again. But maybe, in some strange way, we'd both found a path to peace. As I walked away from the cafe, I didn't look back. The past was finally behind me, its lessons clear.